Hello, everyone who is with us today for another edition of the highlights of FMX 1994 to 2020. Welcome to the show. All of you have joined the interactive room via our website, fmx.de. You can use the chat function to ask questions to our speaker during the show, and we will pass them on. And for those of you who are with us on our YouTube channel, sit back, relax, and enjoy. My name is Tina Ohnmacht. I'm the head of the international network at Filmakademie Baden-Württemberg's Animationsinstitut, and I'm your host for this show. We have a very special guest today who joins us from New York City. It is a great honor and a real pleasure to welcome as our guest Professor John Canemaker. Hello, John.
Hi, Tina. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
I feel wonderful. Thank you.
That's good to hear. Well, John Canemaker's career cannot easily be summed up in 2 sentences because he has done so many things, and most of them have to do with animation. He is an Oscar-winning and Emmy Award-winning animation filmmaker, maybe best known for the short film The Moon and the Sun from 2005. John also teaches animation. He's a tenured professor, the co-founder and head of the animation program at New York University, where he has been teaching for nearly 40 years. And what our conversation will circle around today, John is one of the most renowned animation historians and author of 12 acclaimed books on various animation subjects and artists, including Disney's Nine Old Men, Winsor, McCay. I've got this great book here as one of them. Felix the Cat, Tex Avery, Disney Special Effects, designer Mary Blair, Disney storyboards, concept art, among other subjects. Now, John, before we dive into our topic today, you live in New York City, which has been struck by COVID-19 especially hard. How are you doing, and how do you experience this situation, this strange time?
Well, it's physically I'm okay so far, and a lot of people are not, unfortunately. Mentally, we're all under a strain because America is going through a very difficult time on many levels. But I think it's a transformational time, and I think we're going to come out of it in a good way eventually. But it is a bit stressful right now.
Yeah,
I'm certainly glad to be here to talk with you today and to be part of the highlights of FMX, which is one of the most wonderful animation festivals that I've ever attended.
Thank you. And we are glad to have you tonight. Well, to start our conversation, we want to show a little clip edited from an interview you gave at FMX last year with Dan Sarto. So let's start with this spotlight on Professor John Canemaker.
I'm John Canemaker, and I am representing New York University Tisch School of the Arts animation program. And I am an author, I am an animator, I am a teacher. And it all revolves around animation, which I'm very happy about. I admired the work of the Hubleys, John and Faith Hubley. And when they used real people's voices, their children and Dizzy Gillespie and other people for their tracks, and animated to them with the freedom that they had, the painterly sort of freedom, I thought, gee, that's great. I'd like to try that. So I did films with friends who were actors. Confessions of a Star Dreamer is one of those. And then I did Confessions of a Stand-Up from a friend who was a stand-up comedian, using their real voices and then having my animation, take off from there as a flight of fancy. And the film that I won the Oscar for was about my father and our difficult relationship. And that took me a while to make because, well, I finally said, well, I have a life, I've had a story, and how can I tell this story about my father and be fair about it and tell the good and the bad about it. I didn't make the film to win prizes, I did it as a cathartic experience. And I like doing those types of films because they're challenges, creative challenges. I relate it to an earlier presentation that I did here at FMX on Winsor McCay, who was the father of personality animation. I mean, he was the first one to inject an individuality into his characters, starting with the mosquito in 1912. How a Mosquito Operates was the name of that film. And then the masterpiece of early silent film animation, Gertie the Trained Dinosaur, 1914. It's actually a very early multi-plane, multi-platform performance, because McCay used the film in his vaudeville act, and he came out on stage with a bullwhip. He'd snap the whip, and that started the projector, and he'd coax Gertie to come out from behind her cave. And so there's this whole immersion. McCay was far beyond with his draftsmanship qualities and his thinking about animation as an art form than the other cartoonists were. Felix the Cat comes in 1919, and that also is the first character with personality in a series of cartoons, and it was done by a studio.
So in this interview, John, you already mentioned this term personality animation, which will be our topic today. Could you, first of all, explain briefly how you would define that term? What you mean when you talk about personality animation?
Well, it's a very special type of animation. It's a character on the screen, whether it's hand-drawn or pixels or a puppet. It doesn't just move, but it moves you. It moves you, the audience, emotionally, because it has a distinctive personality, mannerisms, a thinking process, the ability to reason, the ability to express a variety of emotions. And basically, it's by the way it moves, but it's also by the way that it speaks as well. However, it started in the silent era. Now, Walt Disney said, back way before Mickey Mouse in 1927, he said, "I want the character to be somebody. I don't want it to just be a drawing." And certainly Walt Disney, raised personality animation to its highest level of refinement and sophistication, and he expanded the emotional parameters of the art form. I mean, when you think of Bugs Bunny, or you think of Mickey or Minnie Mouse, or Betty Boop, or Mr. Magoo, or The Simpsons, or Jessica Rabbit, I mean, you're thinking of distinctive characters that would do a simple act in a different way, an individualistic way. If, the seven dwarfs, if they had to brush their teeth or comb their hair, if ever, they would be doing it in a completely different way from each other. So this kind of is a form of magic that really gloms onto the audience. And it comes from an animator who puts their heart and soul into what they're doing. They have to be empathetic. If it's a villain and you've never been villainous in your life, then you have to find a way to find that part of yourself to put into the character. It's almost a form of animated method acting. Mm-hmm. It's just something that is, to me, very special and quite wonderful to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, you started now with you were referring to Disney, and this is probably Walt Disney is probably the personality or the person many people think of when they think about those kinds of animated characters. But the roots of personality character animation are much older. They're as old as the art form itself, almost. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the early origins? Where did it all start?
Well, you have to go back to Winsor McCay. There's a picture of Winsor. Winsor McCay, of course, was a great comic strip artist, and he did a comic strip of his character, Little Nemo. And this is a flip book that was made from his first film, which was 1911. And I'm having difficulty seeing. There we go. And it's a very simple action, which you can't really see very well, but it didn't have personality. That was his first film in 1911. And he was so far advanced in terms of his draftsmanship and in terms of his thinking about what animation could be as an art form, that Chuck Jones, the famous cartoon director, said, Winsor McCay, he said, it was like the first creature that came out of the primordial ooze was Albert Einstein. And the next creature was an amoeba. He said, because it took us, the other animators, 20 years to figure out how he did what he did. In McCay's second film, he wanted to put personality into the character. And that was about a mosquito. And it was a mosquito that he put certain traits into. If you see the film, which is on YouTube, the mosquito is very industrious. It has a little wheel that it sharpens its proboscis on. So you kind of get the idea, well, he's serious about his work. And then at some point, the mosquito starts looking at us, the audience, as it keeps plunging into the poor man's nose and face for blood. And he starts showing off. So he has a kind of an ego that shows itself in the audience, which is a very important part of personality animation, because they have to bring as much recognition of themselves to it as the animator did. They start thinking, well, I understand this character. I can empathize with that character if I want to. Even if it's a villain, I can understand what's going on with this particular character. So that was quite a success for McCay. And then his third film, though, in 1914, was the great masterpiece, Gertie the Trained Dinosaur. And McCay, was ahead of his time, so there was no sound with the films. However, music played in the vaudeville theaters where he performed his act. He did a lightning sketch act where he would draw figures, very quickly, one after the other, erase them, and then do them over again and have them a little bit advanced. It was sort of like animation. So he had that sort of talent right from the beginning. But he put himself into this film, Gertie the Dinosaur. Now, he did it by standing on stage and cracking a bullwhip. And when he did so, the screen projection came on of this giant dinosaur that started lumbering toward the camera. And here's the first entrance of the character here. So McCay is over here, very tiny on the stage, cracking a whip, and in comes this dinosaur. Well, it was a sensation in 1914. If the character comes closer, it feels heavy. It has a feeling of weight. And McCay was very smart to try to put enough drawings into it so that the character gave off the veracity of weight, which makes the character feel more real, even though it's a cartoon character. In fact, there's a couple of parts in the film in which the character Gertie tries to pick up a stone, a boulder, and she drops it twice, which is very interesting to give it the feeling that there is a weight there and that the character is real. Here's a later example when Gertie picks up a tree and eats it in front of her. And of course, it took a little bit of effort and drawings to get that up. In the meantime, the character drinks an entire lake of water and does not have a cartoony, stomach filling up, but you get the feeling that the character is heavy because the cliff that she's standing on gives way in the film. Gertie also is a disobedient creature. Even though she's huge, she has the personality of a charming but petulant little girl. And at one point, she snaps at McCay, who's standing over here. So just snaps at him. And you can even see the note here that McCay put on the drawing. Snap. She snaps at him. And then McCay admonishes her as he would a child, and looks up the little character, or the big character, and says, "You're a bad girl, Gertie." And so Gertie does the most endearing thing in the act. She starts to cry. And the audience by this time is really with the character. As a matter of fact, we have a little film clip. When I lecture on the film, I take the part of Winsor McCay and I speak to the screen, to the image on the screen. And here's a section where I admonish Gertie after she is disobedient and she starts to cry. It'll just give you a little time-tripping feeling of what this act was like and how impressive it might have been and was in 1914. Ask her to raise her right, because she's not listening to us now.
Come on, Gertie. Raise your right foot. Gertie. Thank you very much. Come on, raise your foot, Gertie. Very disobedient. Gertie. Gertie, come on. The people are waiting. The people are waiting for you to do this. Gertie, come on. Oh. She snapped at me. You're a bad girl, Gertie. Bad. Very bad. Get all wet. All right, don't cry. Here, catch this pumpkin. You ready? Here we go. Here we go. You ready for the pumpkin? Here we go. Here. Whoa. Okay. Good, Gertie. Thank you. Thank you.
So there we are. That was Gertie's act. And you can see that she's still got it, Gertie. She's still got charm, and she has a definite personality. Disobedient, charming, but a child underneath it all. And of course, McCay's artwork was extremely sophisticated for the time. One of the earlier animators before McCay was Emil Cole, who was really the first artist in animation. In 1908, he began the 200 short films, but his characters were stick figures that do wonderful, marvelous, surreal metamorphoses. But McCay was interested in what Disney was interested in later. He wanted to create an almost trompe-l'oeil creature that you would believe in, and that you would feel something for. You would feel the emotions of the character. And then moving on from that, would you like me to talk about the next one?
Yes, sure.
Oh, okay.
And thank you for showing us these pictures. They're marvelous. They're the frames, the individual frames of Gertie, right?
Yes, they are. They're the same. They're copies of the original drawings. Yeah.
It's interesting. He drew on paper, didn't he? He didn't draw on cells yet.
No, he didn't. There was no registration at that time. No peg holes. No kind of registration. So he had to, because he was a cartoonist for print, he put X's in the corners, and then he had glue, 6 pieces of glue that would hold the drawings, which were on rice paper, on these cardboards. And then there was a contraption that he would slip these into, and the camera would be in front, photographing them drawing by drawing. So it was really quite a feat technologically, but also artistically for McCay to do this. Now, the personality animation was such that most cartoonists of the time could not draw as beautifully as Winsor McCay could. So the characters became simplified. The next character that really has a definite personality that really made the character a star was Felix the Cat. Felix the Cat comes along in 1919 as the first character with a definite personality in a series of cartoons. By this time, the studio system had started, and McCay continued to do his films basically by himself alone with 1 or 2 assistants. But there were other people like J.R. Bray, who became the Henry Ford of animation. They had assembly lines and a whole team of people creating their films. This is Otto Mesmer, who was the director of all of the films of Felix the Cat back in the 1920s. And he put his own kind of stamp on the characters, his own personality. Felix was a thinking character. And when he had a problem, he didn't do what other animated characters did. He didn't just, run, maybe get hit over the head and then run the other way. But he'd stop and think and consider the problem. And he was able to express himself, to express different emotions in the very poses that he was in. Some of this early animation had other elements of personality animation principles that were codified later at the Disney studio. For example, his different expressions, his different emotions that he goes through. They're all there in these particular drawings. He was both a sort of a a Cheshire cat, but he was a real cat when he would run around on all fours. And then he could stand up like a little man in a cat suit, like Charlie Chaplin. And he used his tail. His tail became a prehensile tool for him. He would perhaps have a question mark be formed by the tail and then use it to solve his problem, which he's thinking about here. As you can see, he's got a little cartoon brain, he's thinking about it, and he uses it to catch a fish. These are drawings by Otto Mesmer. And in fact, I have a documentary that I did on Otto Mesmer in which he talks about how he put personality into the character. We'll see about 2 minutes or 3 minutes of that now. Otto Mesmer explaining Felix the Cat.
One of Felix's most famous characteristics was his pacing back and forth while thinking.
Impatience, you know, walking up and down, looking for a solution to something. Well, he represents the thoughts of any child, you know, who's wondering and what things are all about, you know, what's up in the sky, under the sea, and so forth. And these little eye motions indicated how he was thinking. With the frowns and puzzle look and the eyes from side to side until, you know, a kind of a light over his head would give him the solution to the problem. Well, I went to the extremes there. He would leap in the air and flip his legs and twirl around and sort of a little dance, you know. Especially used often for a hook and exclamation point for a ball and a bat.
So there's Felix, and he was extremely popular. Popular in Europe, popular in America. Great merchandising came from Felix the Cat. Many of the things that Disney did later were done at the Felix the Cat studio in terms of expanding personality animation, but also merchandising it as well. I think I'd like to mention a couple of German filmmakers since in Germany. Two of them in terms of the opposite of each other in terms of their techniques and also their intentions. The first one is Oskar Fischinger, whose birthday is today. He was one of the greatest of the abstract animation filmmakers, and he was born this day in 1900. So happy birthday to Oskar Fischinger, who did marvelous abstract animation, and I had the privilege to know his widow, Elfriede Fischinger, and just a wonderful experience to know her and to learn so much about Oskar and his work. And the other person I wanted to mention is Lotte Reiniger. And talking about her in the realm of personality animation, because she had a very obscure and difficult technique that she mastered, and that was shadow puppets, frame by frame movement of silhouettes under the camera. And she is also a pioneer in that she was the first woman and one of the first people to create a full-length animated film, Prince Ahmed, in 1926. And Prince Ahmed is a beautiful film that has many touches of emotions, a variety of emotions that are created just by these silhouetted characters. It's extremely subtle animation, very delicate, but it's masterfully done and just quite beautiful. We have a little clip from Ahmed to show you just a little bit of a couple of close shots to show the subtlety of her animation. So again, the principles of animation that led to the refinement of personality animation that Disney did were there already in the atmosphere and were there and were inadvertently or improvised by the earliest animators. I mean, certainly Lottie Reiniger's mastery of silhouette animation is something that also was important in terms of storytelling in early animation, but also at the Disney studio. Having a strong silhouette was one of the principles that they talked about. So now we get to Walt Disney and his most famous character.
John,
Yeah.
before we get to Walt Disney, there was a question. Can we go briefly back to Felix the Cat? Alexander wanted to know, when talking about Felix the Cat, he asks us, you shortly mentioned Charlie Chaplin. What is your opinion on the influence of animation on slapstick and vice versa?
Well, I think it's a lot of versa and vice as well. Chuck Jones, who used to live, in downtown Hollywood back in the silent era, said he used to watch the silent clowns, Chaplin and Keaton, making their films on the streets of Los Angeles. And so I think a lot of the silent movie acting, the comedians in particular, their timing, the way that they presented a gag so that it was totally clear is something that went into the early animation as well. Otto Mesmer, he was influenced by silent movies. He was also influenced, he told me, by going to the theater. So all of these sort of real life performances influenced the animators. Disney, when he started, was also influenced by performances. He was a performer himself. Many of the animators who worked with him said that he loved the theater. He used to go to the vaudeville theaters back in Kansas City. And so he also was able to feel what characters would think and do when they were on the screen. Mickey Mouse is a character that was derived from Felix the Cat. And so the silhouetting that went into him in terms of shapes, I mean, if you take away Felix's sharp ears and put a couple of round ones there and have a long tail on him, I think you've got the beginnings here of Mickey Mouse. So they did have an influence, some of the silent films as well.
There's even one episode where, there's one that I know where Felix the Cat meets Charlie Chaplin. I think it's called Felix in Hollywood or something like that.
There is.
Watching.
There was also a series that Pat Sullivan, the producer, and Otto Mesmer did, a Charlie Chaplin series that starred Chaplin himself and some of the other movie stars at that time. So Mesmer, again, when I interviewed him for that documentary and often would talk about how influenced he was by Charlie Chaplin. So was Disney. Disney also was very influenced by Keaton, by those impossible gags and the malleability of the body of Keaton. But Disney wanted to go even further.
Mm.
It's one thing to have the character think and to express emotions, but he wanted to do a whole range of emotions. And in fact, he wanted to make audiences cry as well, which is extremely, extremely difficult. And when that happened in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it was a big breakthrough for animation. Now, the way that Disney decided to do it is to send his animators to school.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the man who was very influential on what happened in that school. This is Donald Graham. He was a teacher at the Chouinard Institute, which years later Disney bought and made into CalArts. But Don Graham was working at the Chouinard Institute in the late 1920s. And so Disney would drive his young animators to that school in Los Angeles, and they would start to learn how to draw classically, and learn classic principles of art and perspective through this wonderful man, Don Graham. And so Disney also started to import animators from New York. These were animators who worked, say, in the studios in New York, which was at that time in the 1920s, the center of animation. And they came out to California. They worked for Disney. In fact, Disney tried very hard to get Otto Mesmer to come out and join the studio. Otto said that Disney begged him to come in the 1920s, but Otto was, loyal to Felix and thought it was going to go on forever, which was a big mistake. So Disney started bringing out New York animators, and one of them was a man named Norman Ferguson. This is Norman working at the Disney studio. That's Robert Benchley behind him. This is in the film The Reluctant Dragon, but that's Norman Ferguson drawing his characters there. And he had an amazing facility to create thinking characters. And one of them was Pluto the Puff. Pluto the Puff. And Pluto, in one scene, which is a terrific film called Playful Pluto from 1934, gets stuck on some flypaper. And he gets it on his foot, and he gets it on his back, and he gets it on his ear. And it's his thinking process that makes it funny. You can see him, quizzically trying to get the flypaper off there. Here he's feeling triumphant because he's done it. Here he's doing a Chaplin-esque look at the camera as the flypaper comes down. And here's his great disappointment when he realizes he's sitting back on the flypaper. Here's his fury when he's rolling around trying to get rid of it again. Here's his exhaustion panting from that. So he's going through a whole measure of animation, but he's also going through a whole lot of emotions as well. Mm. Also in 1934, there was another breakthrough film that influenced a whole slew of people, including Frank Thomas, who later became one of the 9 Old Men, and that was The Flying Mouse. It's a wonderful film. You can see it on YouTube. The little mouse that wants to fly. And so he goes through a whole series of emotions and expressing himself. He brings a great amount of pathos to the films. So the development that was going on at Disney Studio through the education of the animators after work, also through the Silly Symphonies, which developed technically, and also through the Mickey Mouse series, that whole period was leading up to the festival, to the feature that they finally did in 1937, which is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And it would lead to really amazing breakthrough scenes in which the characters would be grieving over the body of another dead character. Now, this is something that you might laugh at. I mean, we've been laughing at the dwarfs for the entire film. They're just funny, rubbery little men. But here they're weeping. They're weeping over another cartoon character. And they're doing it because of the lessons that were learned from classical art. There was a man named Elbert Herder at the studio who was their first inspirational sketch artist who did this sketch. And it's based on Giotto. It's based on the great 14th century Giotto, who did lamentation scenes of the death of Christ and all of that sort of thing. And here he is sort of emulating it. In Giotto, Giotto was the first one to bring warmth and humanity back into classical painting back just before the Renaissance. Mm-hmm. And he created characters that people could relate to. He had groups of people, but they were all individuals. They were all doing individual things. They wept in different ways at the lamentation. And that's what Albert Herder has done here with his dwarf characters. Look how different they are. How this dwarf is weeping against a column. Here they're all woodworkers and miners. They're just common folk. He's almost part of the thing that he's created here. Look at the different expressions on the characters. This one here, if I get my bearings, that's Grumpy, who allegedly didn't like Snow White for the first part of the film. But here you can see he's actually weeping, and he's in the film.
Fascinating to see how these characters, how you can see the personalities in this still drawing, and which is not even animated. Yeah. But John, we have another question from Andreas Hukade, who asks, and do you see any connection between these early animation? I think he's talking about the things up to 1927, before Snow White, and what's going on YouTube right now. I'm not sure what kind of YouTube films he's referring to, maybe. But do you have any idea?
What's going on, Andreas, on YouTube? Everything.
Maybe we have to clarify what's going on YouTube right now, because there's so much.
Mm-hmm. No, I think YouTube is a wonderful learning tool for classes. I mean, so much stuff is not just animation, live action as well. You can find just about everything there if you need to study it and to learn from it. Timing, all the great actors are there, all the great comedians, singers, dancers. I use it in my action analysis class every week, and there's so much there that is just wonderful. And all you have to do is tune into it. I don't know if that answers Andreas's question, but here we are.
I don't know. But now with Snow White, we are already in the middle of animated personalities that can not only think, but can evoke emotions in the viewers, that have emotions, and that people can empathize with. You wrote this fascinating book on Disney's 9 Old Men, who were a permanent group of supervising animators, and part of the animation board in the Disney studio in the 1940s and 50s. And you show how this group contributed much to the enhancement of animation as an art form, and also personality animation. But you also showed that these were not, it was not a homogeneous group, but 9 individuals, or on the whole, different people working at Disney. So maybe we can have another look at what you said on this subject in the interview before we go on with the personality animation.
Okay.
McCall started as an in-betweener, but was very ambitious and worked his way up, and eventually became a master animator. In fact, became one of the 9 Old Men, which was later recognized as Disney's favorite phalanx of animators. The approach of Milt Kahl was very calculated. He called himself a thinking animator, and he really was. He was someone who thought about it, and he would figure things out and write it down and draw it in little thumbnail sketches. And if it looked right and if it felt right, then he knew the acting was going to be right. And so then he'd transfer that to his larger drawings. Vladimir Teitla was more spontaneous. They always talked about him as if he was going to burst out of his skin, that he had this emotional quality. So his stuff is more Mozartian. It goes right from his brain to his hand, and it's his emotions that come out in this, and he's more spontaneous in his approach to acting and animation. Now, he did giant characters. He did Stromboli, you know, in Pinocchio. He did the Devil on Bald Mountain in Fantasia. But he also was sensitive enough to do Dumbo. He was the one who really focused on that sensitive little character. So he had a great range in terms of his acting. And as I say, it was a spontaneous approach to these characters and just feeling it.
So what I like very much about this, what you say, and also about your book, is that it shows that something of the personality of the animator, him or herself, is transferred to the character. Would you agree?
Yes, and you have to get yourself into the character. You have to be sincere about it. That's the term that they coined at the Disney studio. It has to be. You have to feel it. You have to walk that mile in that person or that animal's or that Martian's shoes in order to make it come across to the audience. One thing I wanted to mention, the things I was talking about there involved two animators. One of them was Milt Kahl, who was part of the Nine Old Men. This is the whole group of them. The other person I mentioned was Vladimir Teitla, and he was from another group that took those principles of animation and codified them with a whole bunch of other people. What I'm saying is that the Nine Old Men worked their magics because of what had come before them. Mm-hmm. And I think a whole book could be made about not just the Nine Old Men, which was wonderful, and I'm very glad that I wrote it, but all of the people that came before that added to codifying and identifying and practicing the animation during the 20s and 1930s that led up to the Nine Old Men carrying on for another 40 years after giving very refined animation. I mean, there were people like Ub Iwerks and Wilfred Jackson and Ham Hamilton. Les Clark, who did become one of the Nine Old Men, started working at the Disney studio back in 1927 and 28. Then there were people like Norman Ferguson, who I mentioned, or Ham Lusk, Fred Moore, Teitla, Arthur Babbitt, Grim Natwick. All of these people were working at the studio at the same time. And then in the middle of that, in the 1930s, the people who were going to become the Nine Old Men came to the studio, learned from the earlier group of older animators, some of them from New York, some of them, weaned like Freddie Moore at the studio itself. And then they carried on the tradition after that. So I had the opportunity to do the book on the Nine Old Men, and I'm very happy that I did it. It was a great experience for me, because if one could get to know the people who made Chartres, or who worked on the workshops in the Renaissance, if you could know what they did and what their personalities were like and all that, you'd jump at the chance of it. And so I felt, this was a chance for me, a once in a lifetime chance to meet the Nine Old Men, which I did, and to write about them, and to find out what they were like, what their conflicts were, what their problems were, and to write an honest book about it. So I feel very fortunate that I had that opportunity.
Is there one of them, or maybe two of them, who you would say had a special part in the development of personality animation? I mean, they were all geniuses, but as you described them as very different individuals, would you say there was one of these nine especially dedicated to personality animation?
Well, I think they all were, but I think the opportunities to express certain things came to certain ones within that group. When I think of someone who had a breakthrough that affected the rest of animation, I think of Frank Thomas. Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, they were both close friends of mine, and they were mentors to me. I was able to send them my work, writing, as well as my films, and they would critique them. They would give me tough love critiqued them. I'm eternally grateful for being friends with me. But I think Frank Thomas, when he was given that assignment of, the dwarfs weeping over the body of Snow White, if that didn't come off, it would be ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And there would be no payoff for the film. But it was a very, very daring thing. And so Walt Disney knew that Frank Thomas had what it took in terms of sensitivity and intelligence. He's really one of the smartest people I ever met. Just a keen sense of what the scene needed. And he explained to me one time how he did it. He said, he had a great sense of humor too. He said, you gotta get a cleanup person, an in-betweener who you can whip or lead or inspire, one of those things. So they help you. And he says, then you've got a whole bunch of sketches by other people, the inspirational sketch artists like Albert Herder. And they give you a whole bunch of really interesting drawings that you can now go through and pick out the best ones that could be your silhouetted pose, your extreme pose. And then, you don't want too much action, he said. Sometimes they just would have tears going down their face. He said there was one point in which we had Dopey, the little dwarf that didn't speak. He could speak, but he didn't speak throughout the entire film. We had him turn away and go into the shoulder of Doc, one of the other dwarfs. And when we showed it in a preview, the audience laughed. This was, disaster. So we decided we would cut that scene in half so that when you see the scene on the screen, he doesn't start here, weeping sadly and then he's already turning into the chest of so you don't see that contrast between the very sad looking dwarf, which made people laugh. So it was that kind of thinking about how to cut this, how to pose it, how to put it there, and then minimal movement. He said the biggest body movement was on Grumpy, the quotes one who hated, Snow White throughout everything else. So he said he's someone who starts to shiver and shake and then just turns away with a big, almost silent movie kind of action. And it only lasts a minute. The scene is only a minute. But gosh, the build up to it makes people cry. And Teitler was another one who, he brought real emotion to it. This is the guy who taught some of the 9 old men. And the Devil on Bald Mountain also. Now, the Devil on Bald Mountain is mostly choreography. It's this magic mumbo jumbo, and he's drawing the spirits and whirling them around and tossing them down into the fire. But when the church bell rings, there's a whole sequence that Teitler did. He did all of the devil, but it's the devil reacting to the bell. And at first he hears it, he doesn't know what it is, and he's confused, and he goes back to mumbo jumbo, but then he hears it again, and he's getting mad about it. And then he starts to do it again, and it starts to hurt him. So he has pain, and he has fear, and he has remorse, and all of the stuff that he's going through in this sequence. It's quite wonderful to see. And it's the devil, an imaginary character. But you feel something for the character.
That's true.
Because Teitler put himself into it.
We have another question, but this jumps a couple of years forward. It's from Nancy Denny Phelps, and she asks, what do you think about the recent trend in censoring old animations such as Elmer Fudd, Yosemite Sam, Tom and Jerry, and where will it stop? Rather political question.
Yeah, well, I don't like censorship of any kind. And I think the wiser thing to do is to contextualize rather than censor. Put it into a setting so that before the screening, there's a discussion about it, and afterwards, warnings about what might be in there so parents can decide whether they want their children to see it or not. So that way you're not saying it didn't exist, that it wasn't there, but explaining when it happened, why it happened, and what you think about it and why it's wrong or why it's right. I think contextualization rather than censoring.
I would agree. Yeah. In your book, you also take a slightly critical perspective on the interplay of personality animation and story. How are personality of an animated character and the story that is told and the world that these characters inhabit, how are these things connected to each other? What, or in other words, what is most important in a film in your view?
Well, I'll quote Walt Disney. Walt Disney said, "The most important part of our productions is the story." He says you can have great animation, great color, multiplane camera, all of that stuff. But if the story doesn't work, it's not going to mean anything to the audience. It's going to flop with the audience. It's not going to engage them. So he was convinced, and he was a great story person. That was probably, from what I've heard and from the animators who worked with him, that was what his greatest talent was, as an editor, as an idea person, but someone who knew how to tell a story and tell it well. And story would be it. I mentioned multiple camera. I just wanted to go back to Lotte Reiniger. Did you know Lotte Reiniger invented the multiplane camera? Ub Iwerks and Walt Disney came along, back in 36, 37, but Lotte Reiniger in 1926 had used a multi-leveled camera for Prince Ahmed with multiple levels of moving backgrounds and the characters on different levels as well. So she was an extraordinary artist. Personality animation, multiplane camera, one of the first full-length animated features. Again, way before Disney. Truth must be told.
Truth must be told, that's it. And she was a German woman. But thinking about Lotte Reiniger's characters, I mean, she tells stories, or her films tell stories, and not all of them, in my view, have animated personalities in them. Not all the characters in Lotte Reiniger's films are round personalities. What about movies today? Do you think this is still an important category to create full personalities in animation, or can we do without, or do you see any alternative tendencies today?
Well, I think that the principles of animation that give you what you need for personality animation can give it to a wide range of styles. It doesn't have to be full-bodied, rounded Disney characters in order to make you feel something or believe in the characters. I mean, Mr. Magoo came from UPA. He's a very stylized character. He's not a very nice character. He's a mean old man, and yet you understand where he's coming from. You feel something for him. He amuses you. He's exasperating. So he has a definite personality, but it's not like it's full animation. It's a limited, stylized use of animation. I did a film for HBO some years ago called You Don't Have to Die, which was about a child who had cancer. And it was based on children's drawings. The child who wrote this book about My Book with Cancer, it was called. And the film was called You Don't Have to Die. He made, childlike drawings. So we adapted those to animation. And yet there was a scene where the little boy character has chemotherapy. And so we had this cartoon of green liquid, and he said that it hurt when they put it in his arm. So we had the tube, a very cartoony tube, going into the cartoon character's arm, and he looks at it, and you see the liquid go down in the bottle, green liquid, go into the tube, into his arm, and then fills him up like with the green liquid. And then he said, my hair fell out. And so it gets to the top of his head, and the hair just fell out and floated to the bottom. This is totally unreal. And yet the symbols within it were based on getting an emotional reaction from the audience. And it had sound, which is also an important part to bring a character to life. So even though it was almost an abstract animation, it still had an emotional resonance to it. And I think it doesn't all have to be Disney. It doesn't have to all be full animation. You can use what principles you want of personality animation as you want to use them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Lucas von Berg asks, is there an example in recent character animation which touches you emotionally? And if yes, why this particular example?
I'm trying to think. Yes, well, we haven't mentioned the digital animation. Certainly the Pixar studio is fantastic, and they know and understand the history of personality animation, and they use it to its ultimate form. I think any of the Toy Stories, Up, Monsters, Inc., you're going from hilarity and laughing at the characters to feeling empathy for them and sorrow. It's just great, and it's computer animation, and yet it has the elasticity and the warmth of hand-drawn animation as well. I think what's great about animation today is the variety of techniques that you can choose from, and just using what you need from the history of animation to make the film that you want to make. And the thing that will make, I'm talking to the students now. Hello. Will make wake up. The thing that will make your film unique is you. What you put of yourself into the film. So learn as much as you can about the history of animation and practice it, in your own films. But your style will come out because it'll be you doing it, and it'll make it unique.
That's true. Talking about history of animation, Saskia Stern asks another political question. As animation has historically been male-dominated, like so many other industries, well, male-dominated, do you think that the animation principles we teach and learn even today represent a kind of male gaze?
Yes, that's a good question. They probably do. They probably do. But if you look at dance films, usually a pas de deux, or Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, you have both going on there. You have the female and you have the male dancing together, and so you can learn something just from the basics of it without politicizing it. You can learn from the figure moving, but it's true in terms of women coming late into the game because they weren't allowed in.
Yeah.
It's a male chauvinists that kept them out, and putting them in their place. It was societal. It was part of the culture. It's all changed now. Most of the animation students that I have are women or fluid gender, and so it's the whole thing has changed. It's turned around, and it's for the good. It's good that it's happened because we get more viewpoints, and animation going into different directions. The future is very bright, I think, for all different kinds of animation because of the changes it has gone through, psychologically, technically, culturally as well.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another interesting question from Andreas Rauscher. He asks, with the possibilities of digital animation today, do you think that animation moves closer to the language of the feature film? Or do you observe options for new creative hybrids beyond the traditional genres?
I think hybrids, and look at what's happening now with COVID. We're all on our little phones, quite more than we ever want to. I just spent the last semester at NYU teaching online, remotely. I enjoyed it very much. I also enjoy speaking in person. There's more, something going on, more energy in the room. But I also enjoyed teaching remotely. So I think, yes, it's all going to be, a hybrid. We're not sure what kind of animation is going to be coming out of the new tools, and also the people who are doing it now and will be doing it in the future. But it keeps evolving, and I think it's good.
Yeah. Talk about hybrids. Johannes Wolters wants to know, seeing the digital doubles of Will Smith in Gemini Man, the photorealistic animals in Jungle Book and Lion King, it seems that visual effects and animation blur. And he asks, could you please give us your definition of animation and its connection to modern visual effects?
I'm laughing because I'm stuck thinking about it. And I remember what Tisa David, who was a wonderful character animator, she's probably the second woman to direct a feature, Bonjour Paris, in France in the 1950s. But she lived in New York and she worked in New York. She did Raggedy Ann and Andy with Dick Williams and a whole bunch of commercials. When she went to get her job at UPA in New York, Grim Natwick was her boss, the man who had animated Snow White. And he was a big Midwesterner, and she was a small, petite Hungarian woman. And she came into the room for the interview, and he said, "Wow, Tisa, what do you think? What is animation to you?" And she said, "Animation is animation." And that's my answer to you.
Thank you. Thank you. John,
yes,
I'm afraid we're almost at the end of this show. We have we've talked for a whole hour. It seems like it has only been 10 minutes. And I want to thank you very, very much for not only doing this interview with me, but also bringing all the material and showing it to us, and sharing your experience, your firsthand experience with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to be working with you again. I really enjoy FMX, and I thank Andreas for inviting me as well. He's a wonderful, brilliant animator and filmmaker. My presentation perhaps was a little bit, shall we say, old school, but and I agree with what Susan Sontag said. She said, "My writing is better than my talking because I can rewrite everything." So,
well, it was a pleasure listening to you, and it was a real privilege for me, but also for our students, I think. So thank you very much. I enjoyed listening a lot. And since this show is called Highlights of FMX, we end with a historical FMX trailer. I'm not sure if you know it. The one we're showing today, it's from the year 2010. It's by Benjamin Swieczynski, and it's called Only Human. And we'll have a look at it now. Here we go. I think this trailer fits very well in these times. It's a little bit of an antithesis. It shows a city, people without the city, whereas what we saw in the past months were cities without people. Well, John, goodbye, and goodbye also to the audience. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this little lesson on the history of animation. If so, join us again on the 6th of July at 8 p.m. when my colleague Professor Volker Hälsle will talk with Sven Martin, who is the CCO and visual effects supervisor at Pixomondo, about animated dragons, how to bring them to life and how to tame them. For now, I wish you all good health, joy, and energy wherever you are. See you again on the 6th of July. And goodbye, John. Bye-bye to everyone.